Good afternoon. I'm Jim Townsend, and I am the director of the Carl Levin Center for Oversight and Democracy here at Wayne State University Law School. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's presentations by the Levin Center's 2022-2023 Oversight Fellows, Professor Christina Kinane of Yale University and Professor Josh McCrain of the University of Utah. Now, before I introduce the moderator of today's presentations, I want to say a word about the Levin Center's Oversight Fellowship Program, which we began in 2021. At the Levin Center, we believe that the first job of a lawmaker in Congress or a state capitol is to be the eyes and voice of their constituents. In other words, to conduct oversight, to get to the heart of important public questions and share those findings with the public in good faith. So to understand this critically important process, to help us measure the quality of legislative oversight and understand its impact and how it can be improved, we established this fellowship to encourage scholars, particularly those early in their careers, to conduct research and produce impactful research related to oversight by lawmakers in Congress and in state legislatures. Each year, the fellowship offers funding to support one-year non-resident scholars to conduct research and produce a scholarly paper on issues related to congressional or state-level oversight or related issues. For additional information about the award, please visit our website. That's levin-center.org, and the URL is posted on the chat. And you can also, when you're there, you can read about the prior work of Oversight Fellows and watch a video of their presentations of their work. Now, let me introduce Professor Jason MacDonald, who will moderate today's presentations and Q&A with this year's Oversight Fellows. Jason MacDonald is Associate Professor of Political Science at West Virginia University. Professor MacDonald's research examines how Congress addresses policy problems and, in doing so, attempts to maintain power and legitimacy within the U.S. separation of power system. He focuses on how and why Congress tries to influence the executive branch after Congress has delegated policymaking authority to the bureaucracy. He has published articles in the American Political Science Review, American Politics Research, Legislative Studies Quarterly, and numerous other academic journals. He is also a past recipient of the Outstanding Researcher Award from the Eberly College of Arts and Sciences. So with that, let me congratulate our fellows, Professors Kinane and McCrain, and thank you, Professor MacDonald, for serving as moderator. We greatly appreciate it. And let me turn things over to you, Jason. Please take it away.
Thanks, Jim. So I had the pleasure of reading these papers, and I'll just note that both of these projects, before turning it over to the fellows, both of these projects have substantial promise when it comes to improving our understanding of interbranch policymaking generally and of oversight specifically. And without recapitulating 4 decades plus of research on oversight, I'll just note that a lot of research focuses on assessing whether Congress conducts sufficient oversight of the bureaucracy. And then a lot of this research assesses why Congress will engage in more or less oversight during a given period of time. And with more oversight often occurring as policy disagreement between Congress and the president increases. Both of these projects have promise because what they do is they really look under the hood at strategies and at decisions that are made within the legislative and executive branches. Decisions that can promote or fail to promote oversight, fail to promote the effectiveness of Congress as a policymaking institution. Josh McCrain and George Krause's paper examines investments that committees make or don't make in staff, that because staff can facilitate legislative productivity, they can facilitate lawmaking and also oversight. Such productivity, and I would say that oversight could be studied as a dependent variable in the analysis using data from this project. It doesn't occur in a vacuum. Committees can decide to invest in it or not. So they chart these investments over time and across committees, and they present some initial findings with real promise for helping us understand how staffing investments in Congress can facilitate Congress's effectiveness as a lawmaking institution. Christina's paper also looks under the hood of decision-making in Congress and focuses on how Congress might respond to the president when the president uses acting appointments to the bureaucracy to bypass Senate confirmation. And I should say both panelists, importantly, both panelists engage in painstaking and time-consuming research to collect the data for these projects, research that the Levin Center facilitated through its investment in these scholars. So Christina's question is also an important question. Can Congress respond to acting appointments through oversight? Does it? And she also provides initial analyses that with important implications for understanding whether Congress can do its job given an increasingly strong executive branch. So with that, I believe Christina is going to present first.
Thank you so much, Jason, and thank you so much to the Levin Center for their generous support of this research. I'm really excited to present today what is, very early preliminary findings and work, and the majority of this fellowship project focused on data collection, as Jason kind of hinted at. And so I'm very excited to share that with you. And let me just go ahead and share my screen. So as Jason had mentioned, the question that I'm looking at focuses on acting appointees, or what I can call, what I term in this project as congressional oversight of unconfirmed appointees. And the research question at the heart of the data collection enterprise that the Levin Center Fellowship was able to support throughout this last year is, how does Congress's oversight activity respond to a federal bureaucracy led by the president's unconfirmed acting appointees? Now, we might think through why this would be important, and a part of that comes out of work that I have done, and a book that I'm working on finishing up now on the president's strategic use of acting appointees and strategic use of vacancies. Vacancies being the absence of a Senate confirmed appointee in positions that require Senate confirmation, and recognizing the fact that all presidential administrations experience vacancies in their appointments to leadership, executive branch positions. And so, because we have this long-standing and rather pervasive use of alternative appointments to these really important and powerful policymaking positions that require Senate confirmation, but in fact, acting appointees are filling these positions without that preemptive oversight of Senate confirmation. And importantly, then, the absence of Senate confirmed appointees is not the absence of politically driven policymaking and agency action. It's not that these positions are left empty to be idle and produce no agency action for which Congress should monitor and hold officials to account. And part of the reason why these positions are not left empty is because of various procedural regimes that have bestowed upon the president the ability to fill these positions with temporary acting appointees. The first of which was the Vacancies Act in the 1800s, which was reformed by the Presidential Transition Effectiveness Act in 1988, which extended the time period at which actings could serve in their positions. The Vacancies Act allowed actings to serve for 30 days. That persisted for almost 100 years. Then in 1988, Congress deemed that it was necessary to allow the president to be able to fill these positions with acting, unconfirmed, temporary appointees who could serve up to 120 days. That procedural regime lasted until the current one, Federal Vacancies Reform Act in 1998, which created additional stipulations for who these actings could be, and at the same time extended the time period at which they could serve in these positions. And so because of these procedural regimes, presidents are able to strategically use strategically use actings and avoid Senate confirmation in order to advance their policy preferences. My previous research finds that, in fact, they do. And just to give you a little taste of the frequency and the extent of acting administration, this is original data that I collected as a part of the book project that predates this current oversight project. But this is the percent of position days. So because I collected a continuous data set on all appointees across all 15 executive departments from 1981 to 2021, I'm able to find and to demonstrate the patterns of exactly how many days each year these positions are vacant, as in they do not have a Senate confirmed appointee. That's the gray line here. And how many days they're left empty or filled with an interim acting appointee, the orange and blue lines there. And as you can see, there's not only variation in the staffing decisions that the president is making to fill these vacancies. It's varied over time and administration, but it also varies over department and position. And so it's the act of filling these positions with individuals who inherently have not undergone Senate confirmation. They have not had that first step of vetting. They have not engaged in that first preemptive oversight from Congress, but rather they are unilaterally selected by the president to fill these really powerful leadership positions that have a vast sense of authority and jurisdiction over many different policy areas. And so that brings us to our question of what Congress has done to kind of pull back some of that, and to talk a little bit, just very briefly, on the fact that these acting appointees are not standing by and just holding steady. They make policy, they enforce laws, they implement political agendas, and they respond to crises. Just a very quick example, acting assistant secretaries, just assistant secretaries, not general counsels, secretaries, deputy secretaries, inspectors general, administrators, but just those that served as acting assistant secretaries, signed 960 proposed rules and over 1,300 final rules in the Federal Register from 1981 to 2021. They make funding and grant award decisions. For example, Biden's acting assistant secretary of energy for fossil fuels, Jennifer Wilcox, served for the first almost 2 years of the Biden term and oversaw $10 billion in funding for carbon capture innovation. These acting appointees also impact agency administration. For example, Trump's acting Bureau of Land Management Director, William Perry Penley, moved the Bureau of Land Management's headquarters to Grand Junction, Colorado from Washington, D.C. And in doing so, decreased the workforce of FTEs who would not relocate from DC to Colorado. And acting general counsels and inspectors general issue opinions, they render enforcement decisions, and they conduct investigations. So these are appointees that require Congress's oversight and for whom Congress should be paying attention to. And so, as I mentioned previously, these acting appointees serve without preemptive oversight of Senate confirmation. And so the project at hand that the Levin Center so generously funded was to kick off a research agenda to explore how does Congress react to the president's unconfirmed acting appointees? How is Congress monitoring the president's acting appointees when they are not centrally identified like their Senate confirmed counterparts? In fact, Representative Katie Porter has essentially argued that the answer to this question is not very well. She sponsored the Accountability for Acting Officials Act in 2021 as one of the first pieces of legislation to close the loopholes of the FVRA and to strengthen transparency and reporting requirements for acting officials. And while her bill largely responds to the Trump administration's flagrant use of acting appointees, we cannot really adjudicate whether Congress has engaged in the same level of oversight for acting appointees as they have for Senate confirmed ones. And the reason why is because there isn't a centralized database, a comprehensive counting of acting appointees It has not been maintained by the federal government. The only reason why we're able to engage in this kind of analysis now is because I have spent the last 2.5 years collecting this continuous data, and I'm able to merge this in with the data I collected as a part of the Levin Fellowship on oversight hearings to be able to ask and answer the question of, is Congress holding acting and confirmed appointees similarly accountable? And what institutional and political conditions influence the attention that Congress pays to the types of appointees that the president selects to manage the federal bureaucracy? That it's not just enough for us to pay attention to those in permanent capacity, having achieved Senate confirmation, but also we need to pay attention to those who have not. So the fellowship research project itself was a data collection enterprise that had 3 different phases. The first of which was to collect hearings data using web scraping methods and to process that data on agency appointees called to testify at congressional oversight and Senate confirmation hearings from 1981 to 2020. This was a painstaking exercise in order to process and standardize the appointees, their positions, the departments. But I was able to, with the excellent team of research assistants, I was able to prepare and process that data so that I could enter phase 2 and merge that data with this vacancies, politics, appointments data on acting and confirmed appointees, their positions, and also their tenure that I had previously collected as a part of my research agenda that predates this fellowship. And it's with this merged data that I'm able to offer some descriptive analyses of the patterns of hearing appearances and the political influences of congressional oversight of unconfirmed and confirmed appointees. So the endeavor that this project and what I will present to you as the initial findings are really to take stock. They are to take stock of something that we just don't know. Representative Porter's bill asked or stipulated, rather, not asked, but stipulated that acting appointees should have to appear in front of a congressional committee, either House or Senate, within 60 days of serving in their term. And the part of that implicitly assumes that this has not been occurring, or that if it has been occurring, that certain acting appointees have not been regularly being held to account in front of committees, having not achieved that Senate confirmation. But it's with this brand new data that we're able to really take stock of just how long acting appointees have served in their positions before they've sat in front of a congressional committee, and for those circumstances in which they actually served the entire time without ever being called to testify. So I just want to very briefly, this part of the data set itself is, as I had mentioned, it predates the fellowship, but it's important that I walk you through just very quickly the continuous appointments data that I end up merging the hearings data with, because it's with that data that we're able to also understand the percentage and the distribution of actings who do not appear in congressional testimony records, that congressional hearing records. So to collect this data, I collected for 563 PIS positions across the 15 executive departments from 1981 to 2020. It covers unique tenure periods for over 7,500 acting and confirmed appointees. So this is continuous data spanning 1981 to 2020. And over the course of 2 years, I started with personnel records from the Office of Personnel Management that were generously shared with me from Ann Joseph O'Connell, a wonderful political scientist and law professor at Stanford Law, and then also supplemented with OPM records that I FOIA'd myself. This we supplemented with official nominations records from those who have been confirmed. We tracked out all of the positions across all of their various changing titles. And then we supplemented that with vacancy records from the Government Accountability Office and filled in all of the missing parts of all of the actings. We found all of the actings using official signatures and testimony from congressional hearings, the Federal Register, archived C-SPAN from departmental communications, press releases, FOIA'd emails, archived department websites, And then we weren't when we still had gaps in those records, we searched for and scoured the internet for reported titles and news articles, LinkedIn profiles, biographies, obituaries, federal court filings, and all the way down to even high school reunion newsletters. So we were able to construct, myself and a wonderful team of Yale undergrad research assistants, this continuous data. And putting that aside, but I'll bring that back out in just a second, as a part of this, the Levin Center Fellowship, I constructed a data set of the hearings collection. We scraped using web scraping methods, all congressional appearances of bureaucrats under official capacities, the type and subject of the hearings, and if there are multiple witnesses within those hearings, so that we could identify just who was testifying in front of congressional committees. The largest part of the data set is over 333,000 observations of unique witness committee appearances, and we categorized 47,800 bureaucrat witnesses, standardized their names and positions, and then hand-coded and verified nearly 20,000 witness positions to prepare for the data set merge with the vacancy politics data. And it's combining that vacancies politics continuous data with the congressional witness data that yielded over 30,000 observations of appointees appearing in front of congressional hearings in confirmed and unconfirmed capacities, as well as those appointees who were both confirmed and unconfirmed who never sat in front of a congressional hearing throughout their tenure. So it's over 18,000 appointee hearing observations, nearly 12,600 appointee year observations for those individuals who served without having testified in front of a congressional committee. And when we shrink down to the unique appointees covered, we have over 6,100 of those individuals covering from 1981 to 2020. So as you can see here in table 1 is a breakdown of the unique appointments for confirmed appointees and acting appointees. And then the percentage within those categories of those who served without any hearing and those who served having at least one hearing and one appearance in front of a congressional committee. And as you can see, acting appointees are not appearing. 60% of acting appointees served without ever sitting in front of a congressional committee. And that compares to 34% of confirmed appointees who have. And so you might question, okay, well, has this changed over time? Well, luckily, because of this combined data, we're able to, I'm going to show you a bunch of pictures because I'm very excited to offer this descriptive picture of what acting appointees and confirmed appointees as well have been doing as they've been serving. So here is a breakdown over the years of the frequency, just the raw frequency of PIS appointee appearances broken out by acting and confirmed. And we can see that certainly confirmed appointees have appeared in congressional committees at a much higher frequency, nearly 4 times as much as acting appointees, but that has been on the decline since the 1980s. Conversely, acting appointees had a real big bump in 1981. That was actually a bunch of acting appointees for the Energy Department under Reagan, which I'm happy to talk about in Q&A, but it's maintained a pretty steady pace. So then you might question, well, is this something that varies by committee? Well, or sorry, excuse me, first by department. Then I can tell you, yes, it does. Not only are these appearances varying by department, this is the total number of hearing appearances of acting and confirmed appointees over this time period. Of course, as we might imagine, defense is one of the highest represented sets of departments. That's because they have so many appointees. They're covering, Army, Air Force, and Navy, as well as DOD. But that there's a nice variation across these departments that leads us to believe that we should explore this in greater detail. It also varies by committee. As you can see, these are the House committees from 1981 to 2021, and it varies by Senate committee as well. There's a lot of things to explore as to why this What explains this variation? Are these committees better staffed, as I'm sure Josh will be able to speak to on his work? Are they paying attention? Is it that they're monitoring? There's more regular monitoring. Is it calling back all the way to the seminal work of McCubbins and Schwartz and thinking through fire alarms versus police patrols? There's a lot of really great questions that come out of this variation. But more importantly, what we can really draw out with the richness and the depth of this data, we're able to also identify how long these individuals have been serving, because time is of the essence, particularly for these types of appointments. The amount of time that they spend is going to be really important for policymaking, for decisions that these individuals are making, and to having held them account, as Representative Porter stipulated in her proposed legislation, that they should be held to account within 60 days. So here we can see that actually 50% of acting appointees appeared in front of a congressional committee within 121 days of their tenure. On average, it's about 175 days. So that's quite a bit more than 60 days, but it is encouraging to see that at least there is this call of witnesses to sit in front of congressional committees. And we might want to compare that as well to confirmed appointees, and we're able to do that because of this continuous data. And we can see that actually acting appointees are called forward earlier in their tenure than confirmed appointees, which is really interesting as well. Confirmed appointees have an average first appearance at 461 days. But the purpose of this project, or rather the motivation of this project, was to understand how many acting appointees are going unnoticed, are being ignored by the congressional oversight structure, how many are serving without Senate confirmation and without having been called to testify in front of a congressional committee. And so here we have the distribution of those without a hearing appearance. And this is a bit more of a downer that actually. On average, individuals who serve in an acting capacity without appearing before a committee serve for 261 days. And so that's something more to be explored. This is quite still less than those that are confirmed appointees who serve without appearing before a committee. But remember, those confirmed appointees at least had that preemptive oversight touch point of Senate confirmation. So we then might ask, well, knowing how many don't appear and how many do is really important, but it'd be really good to understand the percentage across time. And so here we have a breakdown of the percentage of those acting appointees with and without a congressional hearing appearance across this entire period. And we can see actually that the percentage of actings who are serving without ever testifying in front of a congressional committee is increasing over the last 4 decades. And lastly, to wrap up our initial data exploration of this brand new data set, I estimated these are very simple models, and they're just hoping to orient us around understanding how the interactions between the partisanship of the president and the partisanship of Congress's majority parties is potentially influencing this variation between acting appointees and confirmed appointees. That is to try and start to pull apart some of the political influences of the oversight gap between these two different types of appointees. So I estimated linear probability models on a dichotomous variable that is whether or not an appointee has served with or without having had at least one hearing. Now, of course, this doesn't take into account a whole host of covariates. There's a lot that's omitted here, but this is just to give us a first sense. And future iterations will integrate more of the institutional and political variables that we know from the literature and from previous research have influence over oversight decisions. But just to give us a nice little picture of the linear prediction of hearing appearance by a dimension that I think is really important and one that we kind of all call to when we think about why we would expect acting appointees to be called forward into congressional committees, and we would expect them potentially under divided government. If the president is unilaterally selecting these acting individuals to serve in these high leadership positions, and Congress has a majority party, the opposite party, we might expect them to engage in extra oversight, to be able to really claw back some of that unilateral appointment power. And what we actually find, at least in this first initial run of the models, is that this is actually not the case necessarily. So the red line at the top is when there's divided government and Republican president. So Democrat Congress in at least one House, Republican president. We see that confirmed appointees, as we would expect, have a higher likelihood of appearing in front of a committee. But this overall trend is the highest probability of them of acting appointees appearing before a committee. The next version, that next one, is actually unified government and Democratic president. So it looks as though Democrats are holding acting appointees and confirmed appointees they're holding more hearings where these individuals are testifying as witnesses and providing information for oversight at a higher level than their Republican counterparts. And we can see this a little bit more clearly when we look just at acting appointees. This is the linear prediction of the hearing appearance of acting appointees only from that model 2 of just acting appointees. And this is unified government with Republican and Democratic president. And we can see again, those higher likelihoods of a hearing appearance of acting appointees are actually under Democratic Congresses, no matter the partisanship of the president. So it's really interesting patterns that I'm really excited to explore as this project develops. So this project, thanks, again, funded by the Levin Center, was able to offer a few contributions, that the first of which being the first comprehensive database on congressional appearances by confirmed and unconfirmed PAS appointees. It devotes theoretical and empirical attention to congressional monitoring of these acting appointees and that the president selects to manage these agencies. And it pushes forward our understanding of how Congress rebalances their political control of the bureaucracy when the president is deliberately sidestepping their formal powers. There's some wider implications that I'm really excited to explore: the policy implications and performance impact of these actings, questioning how effectively Congress is policing agencies when they're led by acting appointees, and how that accountability and responsiveness of acting appointees might vary to this level of congressional oversight. And then lastly, what is the political cost to presidents for circumventing the Senate's advice and consent with unilaterally appointed acting? So thank you so very much for the opportunity to present this new data and these initial results, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Christina. Next up, we have Josh McCrain from University of Utah, who will be presenting on a human capital approach to understanding organizational capacity in congressional committees. Thanks, Josh.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks so much for the Levin Center for putting this on and for giving us some resources to do this research. So this is I'm going to call it an ambitious project with George Krause. So much like Christina, this has become a kind of like really big data collection endeavor. It's taken a little bit more time than we had expected, given some previously unknown complications in the data, but we've made some pretty good progress. So what I'm going to show you here today is mostly our kind of approach at measuring the way these committees look, and in particular towards understanding congressional committees and their capacity as a kind of human capital organizational capacity story. And this is not something that's typically thought of when looking at congressional committees. So we think that there's a lot that this can add just alone from the kind of measurement and descriptive side of things. So just to kind of start us off, so congressional capacity is a kind of a big research topic. Institutional capacity more generally is something that I've studied in a lot of different settings. But a lot of times when we think about Congress, it's not necessarily clear that they actually have the kind of resources and human capital that it needs to do its job. So you see, you see a number of articles like this if you look for them. And there's in fact a select committee on modernization of Congress that's kind of oriented towards trying to solve some of these problems, or at least come up with proposals to solve some of these problems. So it's not obvious in general in Congress that they have the ability to do the things that they're supposed to be doing, especially tasks such as oversight. And this is problematic because if they don't have the expertise to do these things, then it gets sort of outsourced to especially lobbyists. So the kind of information asymmetry that this creates allows lobbyists and special interests to take advantage of the institution. And so we're, going to point out that this is kind of has unclear implications for what it means to do oversight. It's not necessarily obvious, like what kind of oversight Congress can do if they don't have the institutional expertise. And so we're sort of going to leave that question hanging in this presentation and in this part of the research, mostly because we're not done collecting data on the oversight outcomes. But more importantly, we want to make sure we establish these measures of congressional committee capacity before we turn to like regressing them on some sort of policy outcome. So just to sort of situate this in some of the academic work on congressional capacity, is human capital is generally perceived as one of the kind of biggest features of legislative capacity, especially in Congress, but not just in Congress. This is something that myself and others have written about extensively in the states. The state legislatures have kind of all of these problems, but magnified. Here in Utah, for instance, legislators have 0 staff. There's like 1 or 2 staffers for the entire branch of government. So it's a real problem. So these sorts of questions generalize to other legislative settings. Nonetheless, there's a really long tradition of studying Congress from a human capital approach. A lot of great kind of qualitative work that really like sort of sets the stage for why Congress really relies on its staff to function. So most of the things that we see members of Congress doing are ultimately some product of the staff that are behind the scenes. There's lots of research that staff affect congressional activities in both personal offices and committees. So again, this is somewhat straightforward, as the staff are sort of providing a lot of that information and expertise to the legislators. And so when we have variation in that staffing capacity, we should expect there to be variation in congressional activity. And that's particularly interesting, I think, when we think about something like oversight, where it's very much like an informational provision story, is like how are members of Congress and committees supposed to gain
I'm assuming that's Josh's internet, not Zoom.
Okay, we're still here. Margot, how would you like us to proceed? I have some comments and questions for Christina that I was going to ask Christina, and then I asked Josh provide comments and questions on Josh's work.
Yes, indeed. I'm going to be the weird voice from the off. I would suggest we proceed with some questions for Christina. I did see some questions coming into the Q&A box as well during Christina's presentation, and I will try to connect with Josh to see what his internet is doing.
Okay, so let me just pull that up. I didn't have it. Okay, so Christina, one thing that occurred to me when I was reading your paper involved the political salience to the president's agenda and the political salience to any given policy area within Congress. That an acting appointee can be appointed to a really salient area that the president is focusing a lot of attention on, or a political appointee might be appointed, might actually be put in as an acting basis because the president doesn't care that much. So I was wondering, to what degree have you thought about this? To what degree have you thought it might condition some of the findings that you have, and some of the findings that you might have in the future about Congress's oversight response to acting appointments? Does that make sense?
Yes. So I will just very quickly answer that because Josh has jumped back on, and I want to make sure I don't want to take up his time. But actually, in the work that I am finishing up right now for this book that I'm writing, and some previous work that I've done, has looked at that strategic incentive that presidents have to place actings in certain positions and to use vacancies in a way that advances their policy priorities. And I think you're exactly right that that is going to filter in to how Congress responds and how these instances of oversight are happening when those actings are put in strategically. So if that first step of the game starts out as a strategic decision and not as one that's just kind of an afterthought or a consequence of kind of a miscalculation, but rather that it's a useful tool of political power to advance policy priorities in particular agencies and for particular reasons, and that's going to influence definitely, I think, the ultimate oversight implications of it. But Josh, I'm going to turn back off and let you jump back on.
Yeah, thanks for filling in here. Yeah, sorry, my power turned on and off on me. So let me just jump back in real quick. So fortunately, this is a relatively short presentation anyway, but so just to jump back in, so we think congressional committees are something that are kind of like understudied systematically in terms of human capital. We think that's really important. We can sort of adopt some of this framework from other studies of congressional capacity and human capital to look at congressional committees. And as we'll show you, there's substantial variation across these committees and sort of how they work, and especially how well resourced they are. So what we're going to do then is develop measures of kind of organizational capacity, specifically kind of borrowing from organizational theory and public administration to study this concept. So essentially what it is focusing on how much human capital and how these resources are allocated across these committees. This is going to be based on Office of Personnel Management, federal civilian employee classification schemes. So the OPM actually does create a lot of these classifications for federal employees. And so we're going to try to kind of borrow those concepts and transport them into thinking about Congress. And so to do that, we're going to, at least what we're going to focus on today is two kind of broad buckets of classifications. The first one is functional position classifications. And this is like kind of like what the kind of job is. And in particular, we're going to look at these four professional, administrative, technical, and clerical. I'll talk about in a second how we determine the sort of allocation across these positions within committees. And then we're also going to look at task-specific classifications. So this is, these are pretty straightforward. For instance, like whether or not the staffer is a policy-specific person, communications, investigatory, et cetera. And so we think this is like a really kind of interesting and useful way of studying congressional committees. We talked to a number as part of our part of this project and this fellowship, as I've talked to a number of current and former people in and around Congress about this, and it seems to jive pretty well with their understanding of what we're trying to do. Well, it's been a little bit of a challenge data-wise to code these things, but I think it works pretty well. So how are we going to determine how much of a congressional committee focuses on kind of these sorts of tasks? We're going to think about this as sort of like a resource allocation problem where you have finite budgets and you have to kind of pick which one of these things you're going to focus on. So we're going to do this with the congressional disbursement data. So we have congressional disbursement data from 2001 to 2020. This is all of the money spent by Congress on personnel. So we basically have line items for each staffer and an individual filing that lists a lot of things about the staffer, including their job title. So this is about 1.7 million individual observations. From this time period, it's about 119,000 unique staff. We're going to focus on congressional committee staff in particular, but we have all staff so we can track their sort of career trajectory. We also have a bunch of congressional committee and member data. Some of this is uniquely collected, including on committee appropriations and how they're actually spending their appropriated budgets. We have committee assignments, and then obviously a bunch of member-specific characteristics. So what we're going to do, though, is we're going to take this congressional disbursement data, this basically payroll data, and we're going to look at the job titles. So what we're going to do is we coded and then aggregated up about 12,600 unique job titles, and then we actually tried to determine based on those job titles what the staffer kind of what their task or functional role is. So we spent a lot of time on this, including looking up individuals to try to figure out exactly what they're doing, talking to people in Congressional Research Service to sort of get some justification for our approach to this. And we think we have a pretty good understanding of like sort of how to classify some of these job titles, which you can see just an example of some of these listed here. And the good news is in congressional committees is there's the vast majority of jobs in congressional committees have kind of one of just a handful of possible titles. So this becomes relatively easy once you get rid of some of the unique ones. Okay, so this is the kind of data we're going to be using today to talk about our kind of measurement approach to this problem. So I'm just going to show you then basically a bunch of descriptives from this data. So what you can see here is there's substantial variation across committees and how much money they spend on personnel. So this is the actual money spent on staff in these committees. This is on the House side. And you can see that this varies quite a bit. So you can see at the top is the House Appropriations Committee spends over $45 towards $50 million a year on personnel. Energy and Commerce is right behind that at like 20 million. But you can see that there's some of these smaller committees, Veterans Affairs, Small Business, that spend almost 10 times less than House Appropriations Committee on personnel. So those are large resource allocation differences, which we think is pretty good evidence of like kind of prima facie something is going on here. You can see something similar in the Senate. So again, Senate Appropriations spends the most on personnel, close to 30 million. Right behind that, Senate Judiciary, just shy of 20 million. And it goes down the list where you can see like the Senate Veteran Affairs, Senate Indian Affairs Committee, you're spending less than 5 million a year on personnel. So these are like large differences in the kind of allocations that these committees get in our data. And I will point out this is just 2001 to 2020, and I'll talk about at the end, we're trying to extend this back to 1970. Okay, so that has nothing to do with our coding. This is just literally how much they're spending on human capital. And these are big differences, especially if you think staff do anything in Congress. So we find substantial variation across committees in how they're spending their allocations. So for instance, again, in the House, we can see that the smallest committees have something like 43 staff. This is going to be science and technology, whereas the largest have over 200. So appropriations has over 200 staff that work for it. It depends on how you code this in terms of whether or not you count people just full time for the committee or not, but nonetheless, these sort of patterns hold. And you can see large differences in the average salaries for these staffers too. So it's not just the number, it's how much they're making. So these range from $61,000 to almost $120,000 per staffer on average. You can also look at the distributions of these salaries within committees, and you get much different combinations. So just as another example, committees that have a lot of lawyers, you see higher average salaries. The Senate, we see similar sorts of patterns. VA is the least staffed at about 36, and the largest is Judiciary with 182, and with again really big salary ranges. So we have kind of two dimensions to the way that committees spend personnel. We can look at the overall budgets that they allocate, but then we can also look within those committees and see how they're actually using their money across all the staff they employ. And so there's lots and lots of variation here that we can take advantage of. And I'd also point out that you can see on these figures is you can actually see that these committees actually have variance within themselves. So you'll see like the budgets change year to year or over time within the committees as well. Okay. So let's look at how the committees allocate these resources based on these functional positions. I'm just going to show you a few here. This is going to be over time. So the x-axis is Congress. The y-axis is the proportion of their overall budget towards these kind of tasks. And so you can see that professional staff in both the House and Senate are kind of the highest, with clerical staff right behind that, but that has been sort of decreasing in recent years with an increase in administrative staff. So potentially something really interesting here if you think, what these sort of tasks mean for congressional activity. And so I think what's really interesting is if once you start to look across committees, so this is a way to look at across committees over time. This is just going to be the House. I've just highlighted a few here just to show the kind of wide variance. And so this is going to be the y-axis is going to be the proportion of the committee personnel spending on this given functional position. And in this case, we're looking at professional functional positions. So kind of like the highest kind of human capital individuals typically in these committees. And interestingly, you see, for instance, like armed services at the top, which is not something that I necessarily have a great theoretical explanation for, but you do see energy and commerce, ways and means kind of at the top. But then we see like VA kind of near the bottom there, which is kind of interesting. And so we can do the same thing with administrative positions, and you see a little bit of the reverse, right? So it seems like that the admin and professional positions are sort of substitutes for each other. You spend more on one versus the other. Again, interesting across committees. You see some variance within committees over time where budgets will sort of change and how they use them. This is something that we have talked a lot about. There's lots of interesting things about committee chair effects and whether or not who's in the majority, and as well as kind of like a proportion of basically how much they're allocated overall. And I think that'll be more interesting once we go back further in time. So we can look at the task specific, right? So I think, the one that we would think here is really interesting for both policymaking and oversight would be in particular the policy staff and the legal staff. And you can see kind of similar trends across the House and the Senate. We haven't seen like overall big differences over time in these measures. And you can see, again, across these committees, you do see variation over time. This is the sort of general catch-all allocation for the House, with Veterans Affairs sort of at the top. So you get a lot of generalists in that committee and a lot more kind of specific kind of roles in energy and commerce and ways and means, which makes sense if you know about House committees. And then if you look at the policy allocation, you actually kind of, again, get like a really interesting breakdown. There's a lot of kind of more time variance within committees, but also big spread across committees. And so you see budget and armed services, again, near the top here, but energy and commerce are lower than I think many of us would have expected. So that's kind of an interesting question. Okay. And so, so we have all these measures that we see both vary over time within committees and across committees in the sort of cross section. So what we're doing and what our next step is does these changes in organizational capacity kind of for theoretical reasons predict committee activity? And this is sort of what Christina hinted at in her presentation, is that, you know, we think that like what happens in Congress is sort of a product of the way it uses its resources. And there's no reason to think any differently for committees. But what's interesting about committees is we think that the organizational approach within a committee also affects the individual members on it, right? So it's not just the committees producing something, it's that it also sort of affects the legislators who are members, and sort of asymmetrically depending on their kind of individual positions. So what we're going to do, just as a really first cut here, is regress the proportion of staff in a given functional or task position, for instance, policy staff on a committee, on committee activity. And the easiest one we did here is using the bills passed that were first introduced to that committee. And so we do this by just all bills, and then also kind of quote unquote important bills passed. So what we're going to do importantly, though, is hold fixed committee portfolios or anything else that's kind of time invariant about the committee. So it's not just that, like, we're not just, you know, capturing, for instance, like a Ways and Means effect. It's within the Ways and Means committee. How do variation in these allocation decisions predict variation in committee activity? And we're also going to control for kind of committee's legislator characteristics as well, like distance and ideological distance and that sort of thing. And so again, because this is preliminary, what I'll tell you we find is that within committee variation, again, holding fixed these kind of time invariant features of the committee, it does in fact predict variation in committee activity. In particular, we find pretty strong predictions on the number of kinds of important bills passed that also that either make it through committee or ultimately passed. And this is predicted primarily by whether or not those committees have more policy staff. And that's, again, like relative to its own baseline. So if that committee increases its allocation towards policy staff, we find that increases the committee's policymaking activity. And so like this, I think, is the kind of basic strategy moving forward. We're thinking through other outcomes such as you know, oversight, hearings, investigative roles, that sort of thing. And so we're working on coding that, which I'll talk about right now. So just to wrap up, this is we think these descriptive statistics provide prima facie evidence for the importance of studying organizational capacity in the congressional committee setting. Like, this is a lot of variation that we can explore, that we have the data on. We just want to make sure that we're confident in our measures. We think that there's a clear case to link to oversight-related activities. So what we're doing, and we've been doing for about a year, is extending the oversight data in Kreiner and Schickler to cover our sample plus dating back to the 1970s. So we'll be able to tie that as a dependent variable in our analyses moving forward. So concretely, our next steps is to extend this data to 1970 by digitizing these scanned hard copy directories of congressional committee payroll. We currently have RAs working on that. Like I said, extending Kreiner and Schickler. So Craig Volden, who I think I saw is in the audience, has given us some of their new data and measures on committee-specific legislative effectiveness. So we're working on employing that as well, almost ready for that. We're verifying a lot of our existing measures, especially for internal validity, making sure that they actually do what we think they're doing. And then finally, one thing that we've been really excited about that ended up being, you know, a classic case of this is way more complicated than we thought, is looking at the sort of political disposition within these committees. How much the minority versus majority staff, what's the imbalance across those? And we really think that should matter a lot for the activity of the committee. So that's one thing that we've been actively working on. Okay, so that's all I've got. So like I said, this is early work, so we're excited for comments. And thanks again to the Levin Center for helping support this.
Thanks, Josh. So I already asked Christina a question during a little bit of a pause during the panel. So why don't I make a couple comments, or not really even comments, ask Josh a couple questions and get his responses to my thoughts, and then come back to Christina, and then we can go to the audience. Josh, one thing I was wondering about might be whether you see different, I mean, I guess to put it from a methodological standpoint, whether you might see different slopes across different periods of time when it comes to committee investments and staff, and their effects on oversight, their effects on congressional effectiveness, congressional productivity. In particular, I think about the current period of polarization, ideological polarization, and partisan warfare as potentially just choking off anything good that a committee chair might want to do. Potentially, that we really want to invest in staff here so that we can do this immigration bill. Oh, good luck. Make all the investments you want. Whereas, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you update your data through the 1970s, backdate it to the 1970s to see that, perhaps in the 1970s, 1980s, when these investments were made across committee jurisdictions, you see more results. I'm reminded of David King's book on committee jurisdictions when he was talking about the science committee under, was it George Miller, and that the committee had kind of laid dormant for years and had a real renaissance under Miller. Presumably your data might show there was committee investments at that time and science started doing more, maybe more oversight. And so I don't know, it's just something to think about. I'm interested in your response to that.
Yeah, thank you. A couple quick responses is one, obviously what we have here is sort of in equilibrium to whatever the institutional arrangement is in Congress. It hasn't really changed that much in the past, 2 decades, especially in terms of how the institution works. So we are just studying this in equilibrium, but so that's the advantage of sort of getting us back to 1970s is you get institutional change that produces variation, especially in how committees worked, how those changed in the 90s, obviously was a big deal. So yeah, we're looking forward to taking advantage of that, which is why we think it's really important to get back that far. So just on the jurisdiction thing, so we spent a lot of time thinking about that. So the jurisdictional thing, it turns out it's not straightforward to measure. It's also not obvious that it really changes that much, at least in this sample that we have. So having tried to come up with ways to measure it, it doesn't really look like it changes that much. So that's kind of interesting. It's like, so you get this sort of setting where, again, we're in equilibrium, jurisdictions are maintaining mostly about the same. And so we're still getting a decent amount of fluctuation in the way that they use these resources, despite the sort of entrenched partisanship and polarization within these committees, which means that there's still there's something going on here, right? And so I have a paper with Christian Fong where we suggest that Congress actually, especially congressional leadership, is sort of using its committee resources as like a reward for getting the party to work hard for itself, right? And so that could be something else that's relevant here is the leadership knows that it needs to make these committees, regardless of the polarization, attractive to try to get people to work hard to be on them, which is sort of a backwards way of it getting into that. But yeah, thank you for the comments.
Sure. Let me go over to Christina, and then I have another question for you, Josh, or comment. Christina, one of the things I was wondering about with respect to your paper, one of the things that occurred to me is the degree to which oversight can promote policy effectiveness. I recall a paper from, and I hope I'm pronouncing the first name right, Drolk and Kaiser, that I believe came out in the Journal of Public Administration Research and Theory a couple of years ago, in which they demonstrated that, I think, contingent on legislative capacity in states, more oversight led to better policymaking. That is that the legislature can be a partner with the executive branch promoting good outcomes rather than simply scolding or cajoling an agency into doing what the legislature wants, which certainly can be part of oversight too. And it just occurred to me, and I guess this is more of implications. Maybe this comment is more for your last slide than it is for the research, but just thinking about some of the implications of your work, to the extent that it's less likely that that acting appointments are overseen, then it would be less likely that Congress is participating in this partnership that can facilitate effective lawmaking. It's just something to think about, and to the extent that you've thought about that, or that that's unlikely, I'm interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think that there's kind of like two parts to pull out of that question. And I think the first part is what role congressional oversight has, like congressional oversight as opposed to state legislative oversight has in the in policymaking, particularly since the administrative state is responsible for the overwhelming majority of the government's work. It's, where 90% or so policymaking it takes place. And so if there is this partnership, having actings not present at hearings to engage in that similar partnership that their confirmed appointees have, I think shifts more power to the president and creates a more lopsided and unilateral policymaking that the president's able to engage in using these acting appointees, particularly when not submitting nominees for confirmation and Congress, neglecting to engage in the partnership that they do engage in. There's plenty of evidence to talk about the Senate confirmation process and the ways in which senators, extract policy concessions or extract, expectations of policymaking from the would-be Senate confirmed individuals, and acting appointees inherently don't go through that. So there is, I think, these kind of like these two aspects that are really important. And I think you're right. I think it is something to continue to look at and study, as that next stage moves forward.
But yeah, hopefully oversight can be constructive and not
Right.
just in terms of lining bureaucrats up to do what Congress wants, but in terms of solving problems on behalf of the public interest. Josh, one thing that occurred to me when I was reading one of the many things that occurred to me, a lot of things occurred to me when I was reading both of your papers, but I was reminded of an interview I did a long time ago with an appropriations staffer, former appropriations staffer, and he told me that when he was hired, he was hired back in the 70s, it was expected to be his last job. He was supposed to work on the appropriations committee for the rest of his career. And I wonder, could you pick that up in the information available to you? I don't think you have it currently, but if you have the same person's name over 20 years, I guess you could have two people with the same name, but most of the time that's going to be the same person. You might be able to create some measure that is the longevity of the current staff on the committee. And that is an investment too, investing in the committee, investing in keeping its staff happy, keeping its staff present so that it could not do what that first article you put up was talking about, just go work for a bunch of lobbying firms. And I think I'd be very interested in knowing the association of staff longevity to productivity and oversight.
Yeah, no, so I also am extremely interested in this. I've done a pretty substantial amount of work on like the sort of staff human capital side, especially on the personal office side. And I've actually coded up kind of comprehensive years of experience on Capitol Hill for the majority of staffers that work in personal offices. So we've definitely talked about doing this in the committees. It's complicated because it's hard to figure out when they started, if they started before 2001, based on the kind of data we have. But yeah, it's definitely something that I think is important. I've written about both publicly and in research the kind of changes Congress has made towards trying to get better investment in individuals, especially the changes that Pelosi made recently to the way congressional compensation works for staff, which really only benefits committee staff. So we should find an effect on that, frankly. It's complicated because it doesn't necessarily always coincide with bigger budgets, but it is something that I think is important and would coincide well with what else has been written about the human capital approach to studying legislatures and policymaking institutions.
Great, thanks. Well, why don't we turn the floor over to some of our participants, some of the folks who've been watching for the past hour and a half. And Margot, do you want to lead the Q&A? I don't see where I'd be happy to do it. I don't see where I can see who's present.
So you should be able to just open the Q&A box and in the little icons at the bottom and read from there.
Okay. I see one enough. Well, here's a question from Irvin McCulloch, who worked, I think, evidently as an investigator in the Senate. For Christina, how can the Senate better hold acting folks accountable? What were some other metrics that might have been helpful to your project, but might have been messy to measure? For example, oversight letters. So, I mean, I guess one might take that to mean you could have, theoretically, I guess you could have a lot of oversight, even though they don't have a hearing for acting.
This is true, right? So like, there's work from Kenny Lawande, who has, shown various pieces of oversight and, work on bureaucrat, Congress, the lobbying, the bureaucracy, and, new work from, I think Pamela Ban and some co-authors on this as well. But I think for my purposes and really what I was trying, and this is like this, the great thing is that this is literally the start of the project. So like I'm in the middle of transition, getting one big thing off on the president's strategic use of actings and vacancies, and that kind of the way in which that can expand power, and how unconfirmed appointees are this really powerful tool that presidents have at their disposal. And then kind of shifting to think about, okay, now understanding that presidents are doing this, how is Congress responding? Because that is the status quo, right? And so reconsidering and rethinking about our questions of confirmation delay. So the question of how the Senate can hold acting folks accountable better. To be honest, it's probably to speed up the executive calendar real fast, like get the nominees through, because the longer that under the FVRA, the longer that a nominee is sitting and waiting for Senate action or for the president to withdraw the nomination, the longer the acting can serve. And so there's this dynamic of how we need to reconsider what that reversion point looks like for Senate confirmation delay, and how having these positions filled with actings who are engaging in political and policy making, and as the Trump administration, the last 2 years of the Trump administration really put on the forefront, that these are people who administrations can use and lean on like a whole scale. Like there's it's no longer that they're just these temporary placeholders. And so if there are these procedural regime in the FVRA that prolongs actings and the time at which they can serve, the Senate could like just move out a nominee, like start rejecting them, stop holding on to them, start rejecting them, returning them, and cutting short the tenure that actings can serve. Either that, or as Irvin mentioned, there are a variety of other oversight measures. For this particular project, I was looking to kind of establish a baseline and to understand, a comparative aspect, since, Senate confirmation has this, this preemptive oversight with respect to confirmation hearings. I wanted to be able to compare that to those who hadn't gone through that process, and to see if they had similarly been pulled forward as a witness.
Okay. Thanks.
I hope that answers questions. I don't know, it's really hard because there's no back and forth.
There are a number of other questions that look like some of them have been answered. You and Josh were answering them as they came up during the talk, and I guess we could discuss some of these matters for everybody who didn't get the chance to, because it looked like some of these were answered privately. Or is that not the case?
Yeah, I might have done that. Sorry. Not bad. I clicked buttons.
One question that Irvin had for Josh is whether you're able to examine any variation at the subcommittee level. In the paper, that's not the case.
Yeah, I mean, so the issue is you can't typically figure out which staff are working on subcommittees in general, which is just a problem with the data.
to what degree, I mean, Josh, is there, would you expect some type of period effect? And this doesn't necessarily go to my point about polarization across time periods, but after, I mean, there was a cut that was imposed on committees in 1995. And it strikes me that if it's the case that congressional effectiveness, congressional productivity is largely a function of staff resources, I mean, should we expect a colossal drop off in productivity starting in 1995, or is there some minimal level of productivity we should expect even in the absence of staff? What does staff add?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's kind of hard to say, right? So, because again, like that's an interesting equilibrium change. So, I mean, maybe there's a short-lived thing, but I think one thing you might, it's sort of like the difference in the extensive versus intensive margin on congressional activity. Like if you think about congressional activity as something like a valence measure, like how good they are at doing things, to me, like that's the intensive margin. And that's sort of where I would imagine you would see the change based on the kind of investment allocation and human capital variance, right? It's like if people are like, this is like, if you take this bureaucracy literature on getting personnel to invest in and like the actual resource specific skills for the institution, they become better at injecting like valence into their activity, and that's where I think you get the actual changes would be is like how good they are doing things. So one of those activities would be like making better policy or doing better oversight or being more involved in hearings, stuff like that. That's where I think it would be.
Okay. Christina, another question I have for you, I guess, involves and it's something that you hinted at when you were discussing the last couple of years of the Trump administration. To what degree is the real issue? Is it acting appointees or I guess this is I don't mean to be skeptical, but I guess you're writing a book, you're going to encounter skepticism. You submit manuscripts, you're going to encounter skepticism. So let me be constructively skeptical here. To what degree is the real issue the president's intention? If the president is in general just not cooperative, does it matter whether you have an acting appointee or not? I mean, I'm thinking of a paper by Lauren Bell and colleagues in which she, I think, argues pretty persuasively that increasingly executive branch personnel, whether appointed or not, just don't show up. They don't show up to testify. They're invited to testify, they're requested to testify, and they don't. So is it, I don't know if this is a chicken and egg question, but to what degree does this bear on your research? Does this consideration bear on your research?
Well, I think, and I think Margot indicated that this will that we'll wrap up after this. Will be very quick. But I think that's a really good point. I think your skepticism is well placed in the respect of, without that Senate confirmation and that permanent status, acting appointees can be shuffled in and out in any way. They're often, there's approximately two different types of actings. There's actings that are career appointees who are, they're not career appointees, sorry, they're careerists, but they step up as an acting appointee and with the expectation that they're going to return to their previous post. And there's political acting appointees who are, brought in to serve in that position. And I think that you're right that there's we need to disentangle how much the lack of appearance by actings is because they are enacting, because they are deemed, perhaps they deem it temporary and therefore they won't show up because they won't be around long enough to be called forward again, or for there to be any type of political cost or sanction to that behavior. But I think also a way to perhaps think about it as well, which is I'm really excited to explore, is this idea of the request versus the showing. So is it that, so if it is that Congress is paying attention to these actings and they're just not showing up, that's going to be one type of oversight gap. But if it's in fact that Congress is just not paying attention to these actings because they don't know who they are, they don't know, because there's not a centralized database of all of the actings, OPM doesn't designate that an individual is an acting, and agencies voluntarily, even though they're required under the FVRA, but there's no enforcement mechanism, so they report vacancies to the GAO, but they don't necessarily update them very quickly. They don't do it with 100% coverage. And so there's real potential for people to slip through the cracks. And so I think, disentangling between, is it that people aren't showing up even though they're requested, or is it that they never get requested to begin with, is I think a really important question moving forward.
Thanks to you both. And thanks to the Levin Center for facilitating this research and for the research that's already facilitated before this, and then it will in the future. Margot, do you want to say anything?
Thank you everyone for joining, and the recording will be available on our YouTube channel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.